Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're taking a close look at the hidden artifact, unlocking the mystery of Ruth's genealogy, specifically focusing on the final verses of chapter 4. So, most people read the book of Ruth and they just see this really beautiful, heartwarming, rags-to-riches story. It's kind of viewed as an ancient Cinderella tale, right? A desperate widow finds love, she finds security, the whole shebang. But the source text we're digging into today shows us that it's actually way more than just a personal success story. It's literally a vital, intentional gateway right into God's grand, overarching historical narrative. The author is doing something absolutely brilliant here. They're taking our focus off a single family's survival and zooming all the way out to the salvation of the entire world.
Now, if you read through the text, you hit this incredibly dramatic, beautiful conclusion. Naomi, who started out so bitter and empty, finally gets to hold her new grandson, Obed. All the neighborhood women are rejoicing, they're praising God. It honestly feels like the absolute perfect emotional ending to a fantastic story. But then we have to ask this kind of jarring question. Why end a perfect story with a boring list of names? I mean, seriously. Verses 18 through 22 just suddenly hit the brakes on the emotional climax to deliver this dry, matter-of-fact genealogy that ends with King David. As a literary choice, it feels completely out of left field. It's literally like reading the end credits of a movie right when the main characters are about to have their big kiss. So why on earth did the author make this highly unusual choice?
Well, let's walk through this seemingly mundane artifact and figure it out. We can actually trace this timeline through 10 generations. Generation 1 starts with Perez. Then we move down through the years. Generation 5 is Nahashon, 6 is Salmon, down to Boaz in the 7th. And then there's baby Obed right there in Generation 8. Ultimately, the whole list lands on Generation 10, King David. By laying this out visually, it's like a giant puzzle coming together. We can see exactly what the author is trying to pull off here. This so-called boring list actually serves to ground Ruth's new baby, Obed, into a concrete, undeniable historical timeline. You see, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, they thought they were just surviving. They were just trying to get through a famine and do their daily duty. But this timeline proves God was actually writing them into a much larger script.
Let's move to and see how this builds. 1,000 years. That's right, 1,000 years. When we flip the page from the Old Testament book of Ruth over to the New Testament book of Matthew, we are crossing a massive historical gap of over a millennia. Think about that for a second. 1,000 years of human history, wars, empires rising and falling, all of that separates the events of this little farming community from the birth of Jesus. And yet, the author of Ruth purposefully left this specific genealogical puzzle piece right at the end of the scroll, just waiting across the centuries for a connection.
And this brilliantly illustrates that exact connection. Seriously, this is the big reveal right here. On the left, we've got the ending of Ruth, that lineage from Perez straight through to King David. Now check out the right side. These are the very opening lines of the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1, which details the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Guys, they are a perfect mirror. No joke, the exact same genealogical puzzle piece that ends Ruth perfectly opens Matthew. What this proves is that Ruth's survival and her redemption by Boaz wasn't just about giving a desperate widow a nice happy ending. No way. It was secretly a crucial, totally indispensable part of the cosmic plan to bring about the Messiah. It shows us that God's salvation doesn't just, fix our immediate temporary problems. He actually pulls us right into his eternal master plan.
Which brings us perfectly to Lesson 1, Real History, Not Myth. Our source material makes a really vital distinction here. Look, Eastern and Western cultures alike, they're both full of beautiful fairy tales, legends, and myths cooked up by human imagination. We all love a good myth. But the Bible's genealogies function completely differently. They act as this unbroken chain of hard evidence. It's a historical chain linking back generation by generation all the way to Adam and Eve. The text is illustrating that history isn't just some random, endless cycle of human struggles and suffering that just ends in death. Not at all. According to this framework, behind the scenes, Jesus Christ is the true director of a real, purposeful human history. Every single name on that list, that was a real person who lived, breathed, and contributed to this unfolding drama.
But let's look a little closer at those real people. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the incredibly messy reality behind their names. We so often assume that to be in the bloodline of the Messiah or, to be used by God, you have to be part of some flawless religious elite. But let's deconstruct that for a second. Perez, he was born out of a totally scandalous, incestuous encounter between Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar. Nahashon, he was an Israelite leader who straight up failed and died wandering out in the wilderness.
Then you have Salmon, who married Rahab, a known prostitute from the enemy city of Jericho. And Boaz? Well, he married Ruth, a Moabite. She was a foreigner and an impoverished widow. I mean, this is a genealogy absolutely jam-packed with people who, strictly speaking, shouldn't be there. It proves that God's history is actually built on the backs of deeply flawed, broken people, not perfect, untainted saints. This creates such a fascinating and honestly a really beautiful contrast. Because if we look at this through a purely human view, that strict, rigid, religious lens, these people are hopelessly stained by their pasts. They're outsiders, they're foreigners, and honestly, they'd be totally disqualified because human religion almost always requires perfection. But look at the divine view right next to it. In God's eyes, these exact same people are defined entirely by His overwhelming grace. The total outsider is completely adopted into the family, and rather than demanding flawless perfection, God just requires faith. I love this. God looks at a desperate, ignored Moabite widow, and He doesn't see a disqualified foreigner. Instead, He sees a woman He wants to invite directly into the royal bloodline of the universe.
Because of this, we actually have to completely rethink our religious vocabulary. Let's take a look at the definition of holiness. Based on this text, holiness is absolutely not about flawless perfection. It is simply being set apart by faith and being brought into God's eternal covenant. The source text makes this incredibly clear for us. Our past failures, our messy origins, our moral mistakes, none of those things can stop God's grace. The grace is just too big. Literally, the only thing that can actually stop God's grace in your life is if you refuse to accept the invitation to come home.
And how exactly do we accept that invitation? Well, look at Ruth's profound yet incredibly simple declaration here. Your God will be my God. That's it. This wasn't about bloodlines, it wasn't about genetics, and it certainly wasn't about proving how strictly she could follow a set of religious rules. This simple, super humble statement of faith was the exact mechanism that changed everything for her. It completely transformed her spiritual identity. She went from being an absolute outsider, a foreigner with literally zero rights and zero future, to being a central, key figure in salvation history. It was her faith that unlocked the door to grace.
Now, if we zoom out from the micro story of Ruth all the way to the macro story of the Bible, we can see exactly how God operates. Let's walk through these steps. Step 1. God starts by saving a lost individual, someone like Ruth, or honestly, someone like you or me. But He never just stops there. Step 2. He grafts that saved individual into a lineage, into a much wider community of believers. Then, Step 3. This community expands over the centuries into the formation of a global church. The text is telling us that God isn't just saving isolated people so they can sit all alone in heaven. He is actively building an entirely new humanity from every single nation on earth. And finally, we hit Step 4. Writing these names into the eternal book of life. That is the ultimate goal.
So the crucial point is, how does this apply directly to you? Take a good look at this deeply personal question. How does your messy history fit into God's eternal family tree? I mean, let's be real. We all have those moments where we look in the mirror and just feel utterly unworthy. We look at our backgrounds, our flaws, our past mistakes, our own messy histories, and we convince ourselves we're simply too broken for God to ever use us for anything significant. But this boring little genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth proves the exact opposite. It is a literal monument to God's grace. You are being invited into this exact same ongoing magnificent narrative. The real question is, will you accept the invitation and let God weave your messy history into His perfect, eternal masterpiece? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.